很高兴今天在澳门文学节的现场看到每一位大家来临。现在是3点的这个场次，我们邀请了许晶晶来到现场。那今天的场次呢会用英语比较多的，所以我们同场准备了一个同时的传译。如果你们有需要翻译的话，会是英文翻到中文的。有需要的可以在我们前台拿着一个机器，然后待会就会有翻译了。那我先在这边介绍一下晶晶。那很高兴今天她来到我们的现场，因为他其实大部分的时间都在美国纽约或是在世界各地，然后也会在上海跟澳门不同地方生活、工作等等。那他是在纽约大学的 MFA 的文学艺术硕士毕业的，他同时间也有在纽约大学客级的教授诗歌，也同时间他也是一个艺术家，所以他大部分的一些观念的作品都是来源于他的诗作，同时他也会做一些影像装置作品等等。所以今天很高兴邀请到他来到现场，为我们讲解更多他的一个见证诗学跟如何从一个消声到合唱的这一个书写。那接下来的部分我就邀请晶晶跟我们介绍，后面还会有 Q&A 的时间，所以大家可以一起留下来。
OK， 谢谢 Kathleen。大家好，我叫晶晶 ，and I'll be doing this talk in English mostly。那我叫晶晶，大家好。然后非常感谢 Kathleen 还有澳门文学节还有姚老师的邀请，非常荣幸能来到这里。然后我会主要用英文来演讲，但是我的 PPT 应该是双语的。然后所以大家可以带上同声翻译的，如果需要中文的话，可以带上同声翻译的耳机。所以今天的演讲我可以先用中文稍微介绍一下。Wait, the screen is... OK， 稍等，它的那个屏幕好像没有通。那我可以稍微介绍一下，所以我的讲座呢是叫从消声到合唱，书写见证诗学。然后我会讲4个部分。第一部分呢是叫见证的诗学，然后我主要会介绍一下为什么Caroline Forshey 就是美国的一个诗人发明了这个所谓的学派。然后第二呢，我会讲到消声的诗学，就是消声作为一种书写的，就是写诗的一种方式，是有个人和政治性，社会的政治性。然后第3呢，就是证词的韵律，就作为很多不同的诗人，他们是如何用就是采访啊、纪录片啊，还有记录证词的方式来书写诗歌。然后最后呢，我会讲到我个人的一些经验，还有写作的方式，作为一种合唱的方式写作。So I'll be speaking in 4 sections mostly, and now I'll be transitioning into English mostly. So my talk is called From Erasure to Chorus. And first I'll begin introducing a poetics of witness as coined by the poet Caroline Forshey, and using examples like Paul Celan and Adorno. Second, I'll be talking about the politics and crafts of erasure, and we'll look at contemporary poets such as Soma Sharif and Diane Quyen Nguyen, who have used erasure as a form to witness acts of personal and political violence and trauma. And I'll be speaking about my own experience of writing through erasure. And third, I'll be speaking about writing poetry as an act of testimony, and how poets such as Svilana Alexievich have used polyphonic writing and the voices of other people to write their own poems. And then lastly, I'll be speaking about my own work, writing with women experiencing unusual situations of dislocation. So first, what is the poetics of witness? This is coined by the poet Caroline Forshey in her 1993 introduction to this book called Against Forgetting, which is one of my favorite poetry compilations. And It's called 20th Century Poetry of Witness. And she defines this poetry of witness as inhabiting a social sphere, a space between the personal and the political. And it includes poets who have lived through acts of atrocity. They have lived or died writing their poems. This quote on screen, it says, "I'm not a historian or journalist, but a poet. Although this might be called a memoir, it is not about myself, but about others living and dead to whom I owe a debt of immense gratitude." 我不是一位历史学家或记者，而是一位诗人。虽然这可能被称为回忆录，但它不是关于我自己，而是关于其他活着的和死去的人。我对他们抱有巨大的感激之情。And this is from her memoir. So what makes a historian and what makes a poet or a journalist? Why write poetry in the face of traumatic historical events? So between 1979 and 1980, Carolyn traveled through El Salvador during its harrowing, endless rounds of unrest and murder that led to the nation's shockingly cruel civil war. How did she come to document the war through poetry? She writes in her memoir, "The poem might be our only evidence that an event has occurred. It exists for us as a sole trace of an occurrence. As such, there will be nothing of truth to base the poem on, no independent account that will tell us whether or not we can see a given text as being objectively true." So it's interesting to see poem as trace, poem as evidence, which is not usually how we think of poem in contrast to more supposedly objective or journalistic forms. This is one of her most famous poems called The Colonel. "What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. My friend said to me with his eyes, 'Say nothing.' The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. 'Something for your poetry, no?' he said. Some of the ears on the floor caught the scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground." 那我也用中文读一遍吧。所以佛奇这位诗人，他在 El Salvador 的就是内战的时候写了这一首他成名作，叫《上校》。你听到的是真的，我确实在他家。他妻子端来一只有咖啡和糖的托盘，他女儿在修指甲，他儿子出去过夜了。他旁边的坐垫上有些报纸，几只宠物狗，一把手枪。月亮在屋顶上赤裸地踩着黑线摇晃。电视里正在演一出警匪片，英文的。房子四周墙壁上镶满碎瓶子玻璃片，从一个人腿上揭开膝盖，或把他脚下的地切割成花边。窗户上是杂货铺那样的透进光的栅栏。我们吃过晚饭，羊肉，好酒。桌子上有一个叫唤女仆的金铃铛。女仆端出绿色的芒果、盐和一种面包。我被问到的是否在这个国家玩得愉快。一段西班牙语广告。他妻子把东西收拾干净，然后是闲聊，有关治理国家越来越困难。鹦鹉从阳台上说你好，上校要他闭嘴，并把桌子一推走开了。我朋友用眼睛对我示意，别说话。上校返回来，拎着一个杂货铺带东西的麻袋，有很多人的耳朵倒在地上，像切开后晒干的桃子。没有别的方式来描述。 他从桌上拿起一只，在我们眼前晃动，然后扔进水杯里，耳朵在水里活过来。别跟我废话，我已经累了，他说。他扬手把耳朵掀在地上，把最后一杯酒举到空中。为你们的诗歌，不是吗？他说。有一些耳朵在地板上接住他声音里的碎屑，有一些耳朵被按在地上。So this is the poem that made Forshay known in the poetry world. The ears who can no longer hear. The act of hearing here is positioned against the ears pressed to the ground, and these ears can no longer hear or be heard. This is a great metaphor, I think, for the poetry of witness, of how we as witnesses, as spectators, as people other outside of the conflict are able to witness an act of atrocity or violence separate from ourselves. It has always been a mystery to me how Forshay got swept into the bloody conflict. What you have heard is true, she tells us. This line confronts us directly, positions us as someone aware of the conflict but unsure of the truth. In her autobiography about the war, called What You Have Heard Is True, she traces her growth from a naive young poet living in San Diego to being found one day by a mysterious Salvadoran man, Leno, who insists a poet needs to witness how a war begins. This is a dialogue. I won't read it all, but basically she confronts Leno, like, why did you ask me to come see the war? Why didn't you ask a journalist? Why didn't you ask someone else? Like, don't you know poets are crazy? And he said, no, in Latin America, poets are taken seriously. Only you can be a witness to what happened here. And she asked, what does poetry have to do with anything? That was my question too when I first began writing poetry. I felt guilty most of the time because I was in college, I was in the ivory towers, and I felt as if my poems didn't have anything to do with what was really going on in the world. And this is the central concern of her memoir, which really illuminated my path towards writing and my understanding of what the responsibility of a poet should be. In Carolyn Forshay's memoir, she goes to El Salvador and witnesses widespread poverty created by the 16 ruling families and juntas. And she grows used to the smell of the corpses on the streets. She watches illiterate workers organizing after dark, and she learns that a human head weighs 2.5 kilos. So she asked Leno this question, what does poetry have to do with anything? And he said, I don't want a journalist. I want a poet to come with me, because only a poet can see the truth. So now this is a conversation that led to how she went to El Salvador. And after she came back from El Salvador, she wrote this collection, Against Forgetting, which one of the main poets in here is Paul Celan. Celan is a Jewish poet born in Romania in 1920. He's famously said, the language with which I make my poems has nothing to do with the one spoken here or elsewhere. In 1942, during the Second World War, during what later became known as the Holocaust, his parents were taken away from their home and sent by train to an internment camp. Most of them died from forced labor, and later that year, Celan would hear about his parents' death when he himself was in a labor camp. Most of his community and friends died during the Holocaust, in which, as many know, around 6 million Jews and other people also died. And afterwards, Theodor Adorno said, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric or impossible. And yet, despite Celan being familiar with at least 6 languages and fluent in Russian, French, and Romanian, Salon continued choosing to write in German for the rest of his life, becoming the most influential German language poet after Rilke. What does it mean to write in the language of a people who murdered your parents and your community? What does it mean to write in a language that is your mother tongue, but also the language that murdered your parents? What does it mean to reclaim a language of systemic murder or bureaucratic brutality? And how do you reclaim a foreign language, not of your own, to write about the guilt and trauma of being alive? Salon harbored feelings of intense estrangement from the language and thus set about creating his own language, dismantling and rewelding the German for his own poems. For Salon, darkness is not willed obscurity, rather the poems come out of lived experience and is born dark. This is his most famous poem, Todesfuge, or Death Fugue. I'll just read a little bit. Black milk of daybreak, we drink it at dusk. We drink it at noon and mornings, we drink it at night. We drink and we drink. We dig a grave in the sky, there is plenty of room. And 这是中文翻译，死亡副歌。我就先不读了。But I wanted to talk about this poem because he wrote this in the aftermath of the Holocaust, and it is because of this poem that Adorno later revised what he said. He said, "Suffering has as much right to expression as the tortured have to scream. Hence, I may have been wrong to say no poem could be written after Auschwitz." What is poetry when we witness the social injustices around us? Why write poetry when we are aware of the suffering, the traumas, and yet somehow we're still alive to witness these events? I think we can look for more answers through Akhmova, Anna Akhmova. She was born a Belarusian investigative journalist, essayist, and read the wrong thing. She's born in Ukraine in 1889, and she was born during the White Terror. This is the preface to a requiem. So she famously writes, "Can you describe all this?" after her son died in jail. And she said, "Yes, I can." And in the face of the indescribable, of things that are so horrible that language no longer exists, she still looks into the face of such horrors and says, "Yes, I can write this." At the same time, at the end of the poem, she says, "No, not mine. It's somebody else's wound. I could never have borne it." She says this aware of her limits of her position and our voyeuristic look into other people's wounds. She outlines the borders of our own empathy, the impossibility of bearing another's pain through journalistic facts or a photograph of a burned figure, and tries to write about it throughout time, tries to reimagine or re-remember this act through language. And thus, the space in between the sections of this poem, Requiem, becomes a place of generative rebirth. In the poem Requiem, she recollects her experience over 4 years and how, standing outside the prison, she is witness to all the people who suffered through the White Terror. Memory, then, is on the other side of witnessing, and it is only through remembering, through poetry, that it allows us to revisit her memory again and again. How do we position ourselves in relation to these collective active memories that have been erased and that have been disappeared throughout time? So this brings us to Erasure, which is a choice in craft, in writing, and as we were just talking about, witness necessarily means an act of remembrance, an act against forgetting, against erasure, against collective amnesia. Erasure is also the very tools weaponized by the state to erase our presence, to erase our voice, and poets somehow is using this very tool to reclaim their voice. Solmaz Sharif famously wrote how erasure means obliteration. The Latin root of obliteration, ob, against, and litera, letter, means the striking out of text. Poetic erasure means the striking out of text. Poetic erasure has yet to advance historically. Historically, the striking out of text is a root of obliterating peoples. When one's memory and one's presence no longer exist, we can no longer exist. Erasure, Solmaz Sharif also says, inherently is an act that embodies the ghost of the state. This is a series of poems Solmaz wrote imagining the political prisoners, perspective of the political prisoners in Guantanamo, as you know, one of the most famous prisons existing right now. She writes, this is a poem written in the form of 7 censored letters from a wife to her imprisoned husband. The poem points out how authority finds dangerous even what is private and personal and tries to erase it. Yet even if we can't exactly know what is in the blanks, we can imagine that the beloved understands, and that intimacy itself is therefore a kind of resistance. I'll just give some quick examples of other texts of erasure. This is by Philip Metris, and it's called the Abu Ghraib Arias, which is a prison in Iraq during the Iraq War, where a lot of civilians were tortured. So this is a series of texts that he was writing. This one I really like, called Zong. It's also a seminal, really important work of collection of poems written by M. Noborse Philip, and it is written from the perspective of slaves who were thrown overboard during the transatlantic slave trade. And she writes about the act of mutilation, how erasure is also a violent act, and thus what does it mean to take on the tools of your oppressor and your murderers in order to write, and what is still legible, what language still exists once you have erased their voices. So this you can see, how would you read this? It's almost nonsensical. But what does it mean for the primal shouts or screams of a people to exist after hundreds of years, and for your heirs, because the writer, the poet, is the heir of slaves? What does it mean for him to reclaim the language of his dead ancestors? This is by Reginald Dwayne Bitts, who was also imprisoned for 8 years, I believe, and put into solitary confinement. And he takes legal documents of incarceration, of state violence, and he erases it to reveal the poems underneath. This one is by Ocean Vuong, which also an interesting example, called Seventh Circle of Hell, in which he takes a newspaper article from the Dallas Voice, and it says here, on 27th April 2011, a gay couple was murdered by immolation in their home in Dallas. And he writes about this process as in the poem literally burns and destroys itself, breaks down in order to be heard. And what does it mean for him as another gay poet to be writing from the voice of someone still alive? This example by Diane Cohen Nguyen is also, I think, really, really illuminatory and interesting, where his brother died from suicide, but before he died, one night he carved himself out of all the photographs of his house. So Diane woke up one day and saw that literally his brother no longer exists in these family portraits, in these physical memories. And thus, she's writing herself into the absence of the photographs And this is also an act of anti-erasure in a way, right? Like she's trying to use poetry to fill in the gap of her brother's death and absence. And this is an example of a poetry project that I've personally been working on called Journey to the West. So actually, I started writing this when I was in Macau during COVID, and I was at home, and I felt like I didn't have any original language to write. I felt like poetry really had no meaning at this point. But I stumbled upon this book called Annals of a Former World by John McPhee, which is kind of a geological overview of California. But somehow, as I was reading it, which is kind of a really, really boring book and it covers a span of like millions of years of geological time, I realized that under the California landscape is these Chinese railway workers who he would mention offhandedly, like in very fragmented pieces, maybe like 5 or 6 times. He would mention that there were Chinese workers buried under the earth. And so I started erasing the text, and I found the voices of these workers who had been buried underground, and I tried to unearth it through erasure. And I heard what they said, and I tried to write it down. And then another work I've been working on is centered on Iris Chang, Zhang Chunru, and she, as many people know, is really bravely wrote the first English account of the Nanking Massacre. Later, she took her own life due to many reasons. One reason one could speculate is having to carry the weight of such trauma for all of us as she was writing the book. And after she passed away, her mother wrote this book called The Woman Who Could Not Forget. And again, thinking about the act of witnessing as an act against forgetting, what happens when a young woman attempts to not forget for all of us, attempts to write down the testimonies of these massacres, but ends up taking her own life. So also, what does it mean for us to continue reading and being able to read her witness accounts, her mother's memoirs, her notes, and carry on her act of witnessing? So this is what I've been working on, which is taking some of her notes, her stories, and then writing and making different collages or works that attempt to carry on her memories. So one thing is looking at the maps of Nanking as a map, as a site of violence, and thinking about cartography or these very alienating uses of images or maps in order to chart the historical violence. And next to it is Iris's last notes that she left behind. So before she took her own life, she wrote to her mother, "I promise to get up in the morning. I promise to take a long walk. I promise to visit my parents." And that's the last notes, personal notes that she left behind. Despite all of the years of research she did with the Nanking Massacre or other research that she did, these are her personal notes. So I attempt to weave together these her as a person, her as a writer, and I started making these works covered in wax. And these are different furnitures I found that I covered, and I used projectors to illuminate some of these texts that Iris left behind as a tribute for her. And thirdly, I'll talk about poetry as testimony. And very famously, Nobel Prize winner Svetlana Alexievich wrote Voices from Chernobyl, and it's her act of testimony where she uses polyphonic writing or the voices of many others to create. So Alexievich interviewed more than 500 eyewitnesses, including firefighters, liquidators, which are members of the cleanup team, politicians, physicians, physicists, and citizens over a period of 10 years. and in which she, through their voices, writes about their Chernobyl incidents. Here, I want to think about Jinjin Minha, who is a filmmaker, theorist, and she coined the term to speak nearby. So she says when we decide to speak nearby rather than speak about, we need to acknowledge the possible gap between you and those who populate your films or your research. And in that sense, I'm thinking about the chorus of collective voices in the Chernobyl accident of Alexevich, but also what does it mean to carry on, be a container for their voices? What does it mean to be an eyewitness, but also be nearby, speaking for and about these other people who have personally experienced such incidents? Lastly, she writes, by not trying to assume a position of authority in relation to the others, you're actually freeing yourself from the endless criteria generated with such an all-knowing claim and its hierarchies and knowledge. And of course, there is a hierarchy, right? You're coming in, if you are not the one personally experiencing such an incident and you're coming in, there is a hierarchy of, especially Jinjin Minha is talking about, a hierarchy of hiding behind a camera, and a camera being a tool of violence in some situations, but also an act of documentation and a supposedly objective I, and here I as in E-Y-E. But the poet also comes in having this tool of supposedly of truth writing or truth telling. So what does it mean to speak nearby to such eyewitness accounts and to write as an act of testimony? Here, another example is Banu Kapil's poem called The Vertical Interrogation of Strangers, in which she traveled around India for many years and spoke to hundreds of Indian women. She asked 12 questions to the people she met. For example, she would ask, where did you come from? How did you arrive? What is the consequence of silence? Who was responsible for the suffering of your mother? And then, collecting all of the responses, she started writing a book of poems with it. And her research is very important to my own research, where I'm learning how do I navigate situations in which there are a cacophony of voices. There are so many voices of people, and how does that come into my own poetry? This is the last section in which I'll talk more about my own work. So in 2017, I was really lucky to get the Watson Fellowship, and in which they sponsored me to do a year of research traveling to many places across the world. And my proposal was that my proposal was very much influenced by the people I just talked about. Forché's work, Caroline Forché, Jinjin Minha, and Banu Kapil, Paul Celan. So thinking about what does it mean for me as a poet, as a young poet who is just beginning to write, what does it mean to visit these places where people were living on the borderlands, especially women who are experiencing forced dislocation, and to write poetry after speaking and interviewing them. So these are some refugee camps that I went to, and I just want to play some of their voices. Is there a sound? 就应该这里有声音。Okay, it's okay. Well, these are voices I recorded, and I barely edited it. I just tried to transfer it as loyally as possible onto the page. And through the recordings, I realized that the most raw form of poetry exists in their voices. These are different women that I spoke to. This is some of my recording process. These are some of the refugees who are put into prison. This is my visits to those prisons and how I documented their voices. These are letters that they would write to me from prison or jail or immigration detention centers. And I felt the weight of their words. I felt like I owed it to them for people to be able to hear their voices as loyally as possible. And thus, I carried these voices since 2017, so for 7 to 8 years now. And I started transcribing their voices into forms of poetry. Okay, the blue part is supposed to be, you're supposed to be able to hear it, but I think it's not working. But basically what I wanted to point out is that often they would talk about in their recordings to me how people have asked them for their stories, but after listening to their stories, nothing happens. Nobody actually ends up helping them. And there's no point in telling their stories, is that it can actually be an exploitative act. So I've been wrestling with that. What does it mean for us to really listen to people's stories, especially people who have less power than ourselves? And what does it mean to carry on this act of witnessing? Thank you.
谢谢晶晶。那我们现在还有一点时间，如果现场有任何的问题的话，我觉得现在是一个很好的机会，可以让大家跟晶晶再交流一下，或是再分享一下关于诗歌，或是晶晶也有分享一些她的一些故事、有力的故事，以及一些观念作品啊、装置等等的话，如果大家想要问问题的，那现在是 Q&A 的时间。有问题吗？或是 English? So now is the Q&A session, and if you have a question that maybe if you are too introvert to ask, we can do it after the panel, and then we can discuss together. But this is her book. 这是晶晶的书，然后这是在美国发行的，然后他带了好几本来现场，所以你们也可以有兴趣的话，可以在现场买到。那目前他也是英语的他的诗的写作，那这一个诗也在美国诗歌的协会拿奖了，所以大家也可以留意一下，这是来世吟有歌声的这一本作品。那现在的时间我们就先留给下一个场次，那我们可以在后面再聊天交流一下想法啊，谢谢大家。